Before we get started with this next session of the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Foundation Ipsen, which has supported the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program last year and in the second year of training journalists. For this section, we want to acknowledge the fact that rare disease has a different feel and texture, and the understanding of what rare disease is can vary from one geographic location to the other. For this panel discussion on the global perspective on rare diseases, we'll hear from two leading researchers in genomics in their regions of the world. First, we'll hear from Claudia Gonzaga-Jauregui, the principal investigator of Mendelian Genomics and Precision Health, the Precision Health Laboratory at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And then we'll hear from Zane Lombard. She's the head of the Rare Diseases Working Group for the H3 Africa Initiative. And she's the team lead for research and development for the Division of Genetics at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So, Claudia, I actually learned about you from a session that you participated in at the Wilson Center in DC, a virtual session. And the title of the session was Normalizing Rare. So I'd love it if you could present your information and tell us about your work in Mexico.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm very happy to participate here and specifically in this panel to really talk about the perspectives from other parts of the world. And I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. So I'll start sharing a few slides to set up a little bit of the stage. You might have heard these already this morning, but just as a quick refresher, and specifically some of the points that I will touch on refer specifically to Latin America and Mexico, since I work in Mexico specifically. But this is a very similar landscape for other low and middle income countries and other less wealthy countries in the world. So as you've already probably heard this morning, rare diseases are basically defined based on their low prevalence in their general population. That means that overall they affect a small number of individuals at a time and individually. And this, to your point, Rachel, this is where this title that the Wilson Center chose for covering this discussion that we had comes in, because although individually rare diseases can be rare or low prevalence, as a whole they affect a pretty sizable portion of the population. So the definition of a rare disease changes in different parts of the world. In the United States, it is defined as a disorder that affects less than 200,000 Americans at a time, based on the Orphan Drug Act. In Europe, this definition is a disorder that affects less than 1 in 2,000 people. In Latin America, there's not a consistent definition. Some countries adopt the European definition. In Mexico, for example, the definition is a disease that affects no more than 5 for each 10,000 people. So a similar scale to the European definition, but it changes. And we have even countries in Latin America that don't have yet a definition of what a rare disease is. And this is important because sometimes, again, based on these definitions, some patients are considered rare in one country, but not in the other. And of course, as I'll mention in a little bit, also the definition of a rare disease changes a little bit between populations, because this is also influenced by the demographics of that population. So as I was mentioning, individually, they are rare. So there are more than 7,000 rare diseases that have been documented. But as a group, they are common. They affect about 6 to 8% of the world population, that it's around 300 to 350 million people in the world. And in Latin America and the Caribbean region, we estimate that there are about 50 million people that live with a rare disease. In Mexico, that's 10 million people. And of those, we think about 2 million people are indigenous or underserved individuals. Now, this is just the people that are living with a rare disease, that they themselves are affected by a rare disease. But of course, we have the families, parents, siblings, and the surrounding social environment of these individuals that also are affected by these conditions. Many of the parents become caretakers, many of them full-time caretakers, so that also has an impact in the economic development of the family and of the society. So again, although the definition is low prevalence diseases, they can affect a sizable number of the population. And as I had mentioned, there are about 7,000 rare diseases that have been documented. 80% of them are genetic. 70% of them are congenital or have an early childhood onset. And only 5 of them have an approved treatment, which is, of course, a huge unmet medical need for these patients. So I'm not going to go in detail on these a particular illustration, but this was put together by a group of patient organizations from around the world, and umbrella organizations for other patient organizations. And this basically tries to portray what we call the diagnostic odyssey, which is this very convoluted process by which patients and families first find out that there's a disease. There are the first symptoms that are presented in the patients, and then they try to find answers and care, and they go through all these loops and hoops trying to find a diagnosis. So sometimes, if they are lucky, they will get referred to a geneticist or a clinician that thinks about genetics, and then they get genetic testing. But unfortunately, many of them sort of get stuck in this loop of going from one specialist to another without necessarily finding a final answer. So in many cases, we see that genetic testing can provide an answers, and some others don't, and we can discuss why is that. But then finally they reach diagnosis, and then that obviously has implications for how the disease is managed, the counseling that they received, and many other things that impact their lives. So since the adoption of genomic sequencing in the US, which is where I did my postgraduate studies, at the very beginning of this in 2010, when we started doing sequencing for identifying the cause of genetic disorders. So the average time to diagnosis has gone down. So currently it's about 5 years in countries that have implemented molecular diagnostics. However, in Latin America, and again, in many other low and middle income countries, this continues to be about 10 years. For many other patients, they can spend a whole lifetime, especially older patients, without having an accurate and final diagnosis. So why I mentioned genomics specifically, because since 2010, as I was mentioning, when we started implementing genomic sequencing for diagnosis and for studying rare diseases, so we have seen these takeover of next generation sequencing and new sequencing technologies used to diagnose, investigate, and identify new disease genes associated with rare diseases. And last year, we published this book that tries to summarize all of these last decade of discoveries and findings in understanding rare diseases through genomics. And why is this relevant? Again, because through having an accurate molecular diagnosis, we can have early interventions for patients that can avoid adverse outcomes. We can access or at least facilitate access to patients to get effective. And in some cases, we're starting to see personalized therapies that are designed specifically to address the molecular defect responsible for the disease. This is also important for planning how the disease will evolve, knowing the prognosis and the natural history of these diseases. Of course, giving them a final and accurate answer to these families. This can also help for family planning if these are young parents that may be looking into expanding their family and what their risk is. Also, we hope that this eventually, and we are starting to see this in some context, but that this will help in the development and implementation of public health policies that are based on disease prevalence and genetic epidemiology. And ultimately, the goal is the implementation of precision medicine in the world, and especially for these rare disease patients. So we're starting to see some projects and definitely much more of a focus into bringing genomic newborn screening early on, recognizing that the earlier that you can identify a diagnosis for a rare disease, the more effective you can have an intervention, or lack of interventions, because sometimes without the knowledge of that, there might be some things that physicians might want to do for these patients that might not be recommended in the cases of certain rare diseases. So we're starting to see these pilot projects for implementing genomic newborn screening. And actually, just about 1 or 2 weeks ago, there was a big conference precisely to discuss this implementation of newborn genomic sequencing programs in Canada, the US, and the UK mostly. But this is not the case in developing countries, in low and middle income countries, where patients and physicians and researchers can barely access these technologies. They are still quite expensive, and there's not enough data also to interpret some of these findings. So this is just a graph to show that in spite of European ancestry populations accounting for about 16% of the world population, if we see the percentage of European ancestry individuals that have been included in genomic studies, that's more than 80% from all studies. And with the release of the UK Biobank, this actually went up to 95.82% of European ancestry individuals, whereas for most of the other populations around the world, this is very limited, right? Most of them less than 1%. There have been some efforts to do more genomic studies in East Asian populations, but you can see here for Hispanic, that's less than 0.5%. For African and African American or Afro-Caribbean individuals, also very little has been done there, and there is definitely a problem with representation. So also here you can see these are the major biobanks and cohorts that have being accrued around the world. And you can see also here there's an important lack of representation in Latin America, in most of Africa, in Asia, East Europe, and the Middle East as well. So again, this is just to emphasize that we know, we have recognized it, and in many instances we're working towards changing this, but genomics has a huge problem of diversity. This is important because it not only impacts the research that we can do in terms of understanding human variation and human evolution and the implications for health, but also in its application, it has implications for public and precision health. It contributes to increased disparities in access and benefiting from genomic discoveries for underrepresented and underserved communities. There is a lack of transferability of association markers across different populations. And as I mentioned, given that there is this lack of data for in genomic databases for these non-European populations. We also have a lack of specificity when we are trying to interpret rare and low frequency variants in patients from other genetic backgrounds. And so this is important, again, for providing diagnosis and for informing patients and families on their risk for certain, not just rare diseases, but other medically actionable variation that may be present in their genomes. So we do need to increase diversity in genomics studies, but this has to be in an ethical and respectful way for the populations and the countries of origin. And of course, we need to implement precision medicine in all these countries that are at least 10 years behind from what is happening in Europe, in the US, in Canada. So just very briefly, what we're doing in Mexico, we've established a Mexican network for rare diseases that's focused on the research and the facilitating access to genomic sequencing for studying and diagnosing rare diseases. We have launched a program for genomic sequencing, and we have also activities to increase the awareness and the education. We have a symposium, an annual symposium around Rare Disease Day in Spanish for Latin American attendees or other Spanish-speaking people. But there are very few activities that are in non-English language for rare diseases. So we thought this was particularly important, and again, especially because there's this lack of awareness in our region, in our country. So we thought that doing it specifically in Spanish was important to increase this awareness in Latin America. So overall, we also are working through national and international partnerships and collaborations to increase diagnosis, research, education, and training pertaining rare diseases. And these are the different organizations and initiatives that we work with in Mexico, in the region, and in the world to try to improve access to genomic sequencing for rare diseases and implementation of precision medicine. So with that, I'll stop there. I just wanted to lay out a bit of the stage, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Because we do have a bit of time, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask you, Claudia, about your personal background. How did you get involved in genomic studies? And you say you trained in the US, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I did my undergrad in genomic sciences in Mexico. So this was the first program in the region. There were, and one of the first in the world to focus specifically on genomic sciences back in the early 2000s. Then after that, I was very specifically interested in human genetics and genomics, which there wasn't much in Mexico really happening. And so I went to do my PhD in molecular and human genetics at Baylor College of Medicine. And having the Human Genome Sequencing Center there at Baylor, which is one of the main sequencing centers in the US, also gave me exposure to a lot of the technologies and a lot of the sequencing. So we, around that time, we started doing, we had a study that was eventually became the proof of concept study to really show that we could utilize genomic sequencing to identify the cause of a genetic disease. Because at that point, after the Human Genome Project finished, sequencing was still pretty expensive. And a few people, Jim Watson, Dr. Craig Venter, had been sequenced at the time, but there was this discussion whether this technology was going to be just for the famous and the rich people that could actually afford it. So there was a question of whether we could actually use it for medical purposes and for research purposes as well, and to improve health. So we did this pilot study. We identified the genetic cause of a disease. at that time and showed that it was possible. And that pretty much opened up all of what we see now in terms of medical and clinical genomics. And then with the implementation of exome sequencing, that also scaled quite a bit the implementation of genomics. And then after that, I went to do a postdoc at Duke, and then I was recruited to the Regeneron Genetics Center. So I was for several years in industry running large-scale genomic sequencing projects for rare diseases and also for large biobanks like UK Biobank and the Geisinger MyCode Health Initiative. Looking precisely at variation in Mendelian disease genes and rare variation associated with all sorts of diseases. And finally, I always had the interest of coming back to Mexico, and especially after many years in the US, one of the things was like, I knew that, I mean, I was doing this every day, and I knew the possibilities of this technology and the impact that this can have. And I also knew that this was not happening in Mexico and Latin America. So that was a big motivation to come back to establish my lab in 2020 and start trying to facilitate the access to genomic sequencing for patients with rare diseases, both in Mexico and the region. And we're sort of working towards that objective.
We actually have a question here from one of our fellows that mirrors literally the next question that I was going to ask you. This is from Hawken Miller, and he says, he writes feature stories on rare diseases for BioNews. His family also started an organization called Cure Duchenne to find a cure for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And his question is, what happens when people with European ancestry are overrepresented in genomic studies, biobanks, and general data? I was going to phrase my question as, we have two different sets of goalposts? In other words, when we talk about some of the opportunities and some of the amazing progress that can be made in the next decade or so, are people of color and people of non-European ancestry going to be lagging behind another decade, trying to play catch up because there simply isn't information?
Well, I guess the short answer is yes, and I think our goal is to try to reduce that gap. So from a research perspective, we are in some ways harming ourselves because we can't see all of the extent of human variation that's available if we just restrict ourselves to analyzing some populations, in this case, majorly Eurocentric populations. So African populations, indigenous populations, East Asian populations, they have a lot of diversity that we just have barely scratched and started to see. So again, from a scientific perspective, we need to see all of that variation to better understand biology and human genome function, diversity, evolution, all of that. But from a practical standpoint, what that means is that currently a patient of European ancestry has a much better chance of having a more accurate and more definitive diagnosis, guidance into how to manage diseases, because we have a lot of information. We know which variants are polymorphic in the population and are likely to cause disease, which variants are more likely to be disease associated, what are the outcomes, and all of that information. If a patient comes from underrepresented population, many times we see many more variants, and that's not because they have more variation that's disease associated. It's just because we haven't acquired all of that background information from other people from these populations to really make an informed decision of which variants are more likely to be disease associated and which others are just polymorphisms in this particular population that are not present or are at very low frequencies in European populations, because we just haven't sampled that. So that's on a practical point of view, how that may impact in terms of health and management of individuals from different ancestries, this disparity in the data that we have collected so far.
I'll ask you one more question before we pivot to Dr. Lombard, and that is, our fellow Sachin Rawat asks, what are some ways to incentivize and facilitate greater adoption of newborn screening in low and middle income countries?
Well, we recently had a workshop about that and to discuss some of the issues and that. And so first, one of the major issues is that in many countries, this is not state mandated or state funded. For the countries where this is state mandated and funded, we find out that many people just don't know about it. So they don't know what are the benefits of it, like, or maybe they have heard about it, but they don't know that they are supposed to get an answer or a result. And many times, like, I mean, the traditional newborn screening, it's this heel prick in newborn babies. The blood is taken and analyzed, and many times parents never hear back what are the results, if there's any follow-up. So there are several steps in the process where having better awareness and better education, both on what the test is, what it can tell you, what comes next, and how to follow up if there's need to follow up, is lacking. So many times it's not that the parents don't want to do it, it's just a lack of awareness and information.
Great. We talked a bit earlier about rare disease research being at a powerful inflection point, a moment where if the opportunities are leveraged correctly, we could see powerful changes. And that takes me to the African continent. And as I mentioned, I spent some time there myself, and I saw and watched countries like Kenya, certainly South Africa, Nigeria, and Rwanda make incredible steps forward in terms of scientific prowess and really communicating that to the world. And so that's why I'm so eager to talk to Dr. Lombard, Zane Lombard, because I was in Kenya as the H3 Africa initiative was kicking off and getting started. And so please join the conversation and tell us a bit about your work with the H3 Africa initiative.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm also just going to share a few slides and then tell you a bit more about the rare diseases work we've been doing on the African continent as part of the H3 Africa Consortium. Here we go. I hope everybody can see those clearly.
Yes.
Good. So as Rachel said, I'm based in South Africa. I'm a genetic scientist and currently working in the Division of Human Genetics that's associated with the University of the Witwatersrand and the National Health Laboratory Service, with the main focus on offering genetic services to patients with rare diseases. And although I know that we're in this session really talking about what the unique challenges are for developing countries, I think one of the things that you would have seen often throughout the different speakers' presentations this morning is that there's also this universal theme that's running through with rare diseases, whether it's for an African patient or for somebody from America. And that is this diagnostic odyssey that patients have to go through. And that is universal, where we're really struggling with diagnosing rare disorders because of the overlapping symptoms, because of the overlapping clinical picture. And what that causes is this diagnostic odyssey for patients that end up seeing many different physicians, going from pillar to post over many, many years, without getting a diagnosis, either being misdiagnosed or keep searching for that answer, which of course puts a lot of pressure and emotional anguish, not only on the patient, but also on the family. And this is not different in Africa, but the distinct feature and the distinct obstacles that we're facing across Africa is, of course, the lack of services and the resource-constrained environment that we're operating in trying to offer a diagnostic service for patients with rare diseases, but also for doing research. So I saw there was a question in the chat specifically about genetic services across the globe and how other countries match up. In South Africa, if we look at the global recommendations for the number of medical geneticists being 3 and 10 genetic counselors per million population, in South Africa, we're falling very short of those numbers. So there's a lack of trained specialists who can offer a service to patients. And unfortunately, the picture looks even more dire across the rest of the African continent. So that really puts a strain on the type of service that you can offer for patients. As I said, for most of the South African country, there's no genetic services being offered. And this really translates into this issue of children with severe rare diseases not getting a diagnosis and often being on this diagnostic odyssey for a very long time. What I'm showing at the bottom here, this is just a catalogue of the patients that we see in our genetics clinic in Johannesburg, South Africa, where the majority of the patients that we see have a clinically suspected rare disease. And unfortunately, for the majority of them, 92% of those patients remain undiagnosed because of the lack of genetic testing options that we have available. So as Rachel mentioned, one way that we're trying to tackle this specific issue is through the Atria Africa Consortium, which stands for Human Heredity and Health. This is a cross-continental endeavor that was really started by the African Society of Human Genetics and is supported by both the National Institutes of Health and the Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom to provide funding to do research that is focused in Africa and is really being driven by African scientists. So this picture here just gives you an idea of the footprint of Atria Africa across the continent. There's more than 50 different research projects that are being supported through this consortium. I think the unique aspect of this is that all of these projects have an African principal investigator at the helm who's driving the research agenda set by African scientists. And this program has been running now for just over 10 years and has really made leaps and bounds in servicing and setting up a platform for genomic research across Africa. So where does rare diseases fit in with this? So there are a couple of projects, about a handful, about 5 to 8 projects that make up part of Atria Africa that are focused on rare diseases. One of those projects is the project that I'm heading called Deciphering Developmental Disorders in Africa. And this project is very much focused on patients who would have been experiencing a developmental delay as part of the rare disease sequela that they're experiencing. And the study rationale for this study is to map the genetic causes of rare diseases in Africans and also to catalyze improved diagnostic services, to look at ways in which we can, in this resource-constrained environment, actually set up a system that works in the unique environment that we're based in, to still offer a world-class service to rare disease patients. So the DDD Africa project is currently based in South Africa as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with plans for us to expand this network across the African continent. And as I mentioned, we're focusing on looking at leapfrogging to using kind of the first tier testing that is used globally, things like exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing, building the bioinformatics support that we need to do those kinds of analyses and offer that kind of service to patients in Africa, and doing that with a underscore of training of postgrad students in both genomics and bioinformatics, but also in leadership and mentorship, and also in engaging with the community. I think this is a really important aspect, is to really consider aspects of mental health of parents with children with rare diseases, talking to patients about genomic literacy, what they understand about the test results that they would be getting back, what their preferences are for participating in research, genomics research, and really building a collaborative network in that way. So just one or two more slides from me. I just wanted to underscore what the benefits are of doing rare diseases research in Africa. And I think this has already been highlighted with some of the talking points that came up in our session now. And that is that we really want to see that the benefit of genomic medicine and precision medicine really reaches a global audience. This is really important, that that this lack of data and participation that we've seen in countries with people of color, that this really needs to be negated and work towards making sure that genomic findings and genomics research is much more representative, so that we can make sure that genomic medicine has global positive impact across the world. We want to really see that there's a benefit to patient care in the long term, even if it is in a resource-constrained environment. And we also believe that there's so much potential for discovery opportunities. So yes, we want to make sure that the findings from this research is really applicable to the individuals in different countries, but there's also global opportunity here. So one of the examples that I thought about when Claudia was speaking about diversity is that one of the ways that rare diseases are diagnosed is that you look at how common a genetic variant is in a population. And if it's not common at all, that's a clue that the variant that you're looking at might be disease causing. But if your database that you're searching through is not very diverse, you're missing a whole piece of genetic variation that you're not considering. And by including information from more global populations, we'd get a much clearer picture of which variants are actually disease linked and which ones are not. And then finally, of course, all of this can be linked back to job creation and skills development in local communities, which is always an enriching experience. I'm just going to end off because I'd like to hear and talk a bit to the audience about some of the questions that they might have, but just to point out that the research that we're doing is being supported, as I said, through the HR Africa Consortium and some other funders, and that we have partnerships with the Wellcome Sanger Institute in the UK and the Bioinformatics Network that HR Africa has set up across the continent, and that we're very dependent on our research and admin team that makes this kind of research possible. So thank you. I'm looking forward to chatting to everybody here.
Zanay, again, I interacted with quite a few researchers and scientists and doctors and clinicians in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda. And one of the conversations that kept coming up was, what is the scientist's role in helping develop policy, helping policymakers understand the need for this kind of research and the benefit to the populations? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't know if you are personally involved in that in South Africa or if it's something you feel strongly about, but what are your thoughts about how researchers can help inform policy?
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's such an important question, because I think one of the issues and obstacles that we see in resource-constrained environments is that, of course, there has to be political will to invest in research and in services for rare diseases. And one way to gain that political will is to provide the evidence of what the benefits are to the patient, to the local healthcare system, to the population at large. And I think that's really where scientists and researchers can play a very important role, is to really think about not only the research question that they're interested in, but really at the global level, what politicians and funders and investors see as important, and providing them with those answers, and really underscoring how important this research is for the global community as well as for the local communities. I think locally, one of the aspects that we're participating in through HR Africa is recently the World Health Organization launched, the Science Council launched a report on the importance of genomics in global health. And that is one aspect where we feel that we can really think and talk about how this can be implemented in low and middle income countries, and participate in that way to make sure that genomics becomes a global initiative.
We have a question from one of the fellows, Helen Shikanda in Nairobi. What happens if there's a rare disease that patients have self-diagnosed, but there's no specialist in a country to tackle it, especially in African nations?
That's a great question. I think very often what happens is that patient and their family goes on this diagnostic odyssey that happens globally, and trying to find answers either from the non-specialists in their country, and hopefully connecting with people outside of their country and internationally. I think that's one of the unique aspects of rare disease research and services, is that because the community is small locally, because there's so few patients, the community globally is not that rare and not that small. So I would think that very often, maybe if there isn't a specialist locally, patients need to be enabled or given an opportunity or guidance through maybe nonprofit organizations locally, who could put them in contact with services and specialists who could provide them with answers if that's not available through their local healthcare system.
Let's talk biobanks, because I believe one of our fellows had proposed a project that involved exploring biobanks in her country. And so I'd like to ask each of you, where are you in your region of the world in terms of establishing one? Are there any on the African continent? Are there any in Latin America?
So maybe just to say from the African perspective, through HR Africa, there were three specific genomics biorepositories set up, one in South Africa, one in East, and one in West Africa, to facilitate this kind of research. So those biobanks have both data as well as samples collected for well over about 100,000 patients at this case. It is small in comparison to what we see globally, but it's a great start. And there are other initiatives, both through private investigations also being set up across Africa to try and gap this divide that we see.
Claudia?
Yeah, so for Latin America, there are a few efforts. So Brazil has been leading a lot of efforts in genomics. They have the Brazilian Genome Project, I think it's the name. So they are doing some sequencing and biobanking of Brazilian population. Few other Latin American countries have. In Mexico, we actually recently had what is the largest cohort of non-European ancestry individuals sequenced, the Mexico City Prospective Study. Unfortunately, that data is not yet available. So, well, it is available to a small number of partners that participated in sequencing it, mostly pharmaceutical companies and the University of Oxford. But it's not yet available. So that's 150,000 individuals, which, again, given that it's the largest non-European cohort that has been sequenced, would be extremely useful also, not just for the frequency data and the information in Mexican and Latin American individuals, but just, again, to increase diversity. But yeah, that's not available yet for analyzing. We are also, there's another effort for in Mexico as well, in Monterrey, and there are a few other efforts that are sort of in planning stages. Mostly because one of the main issues is to recognize the importance of good phenotyping, good clinical data to be gathered for these biobanks and these large cohorts. Because if you don't have that good clinical data, and then later on will be very difficult to do these genetic association analysis. So a lot of these well-planned biobanks are sort of prospective, and they are in planning stages.
Here's an intriguing question from Sachin Rawat. He asks, studies show that Africa is the most genetically diverse continent. So does that mean that the diversity and or frequency of rare diseases per capita is also expected to be greater?
I don't think that the frequency of disease necessarily is higher, but I think what we do see is that the genetic causes might be much more diverse. So there might be many more different mutations that are disease causing that we're not aware of, or that hasn't been described before, that we need to take into consideration when working with African patients. Because of that diversity, it could be that the causes and the variants that are associated with risk, for instance, is much more diverse than what we know of already, which is one of the good reasons to do more research so that we can make those discoveries.
Our fellow from Malaysia, Tan Sho Chin, is asking an interesting question. She says that at one point, Malaysia's health ministry was sending patient samples to Australia for genetic analysis. Is this an option for countries that are under-resourced, or what do you think about that?
So it's an option, and especially right now, it's a viable option. I mean, in Mexico and in Latin America, we source out a lot of samples for diagnosis, because yes, the technology is not here, or it's more expensive. So for example, in Mexico, it cost about 3 times more to sequence than it would cost in the US, mostly because of import taxes. Everything has to be imported, all reagents, instruments, everything. So since there's not an actual market, there's little that it's local. So that's a huge problem for low and middle income countries that don't have these industries developed. And sourcing out is in my opinion, a temporary solution. It is viable, and it's a temporary solution. But what we ultimately need to do is really support countries and regions to develop in-house capabilities to be self-sustainable. So things that we are exploring in Latin America, and I think it's similar to maybe what people are doing for Africa, is trying to set up resources that are regional, because at the level of individual countries, it might be more difficult, right, to persuade governments or industries to fund a large sequencing center. But at a regional level, I think it's more viable to have 3-4 reference centers that can process samples regionally, and make it more accessible, more affordable, and also start creating that market within these regions for sequencing companies to find that attractive, and sort of have a little bit of a break in terms of import taxes and all of these additional costs that come with implementing genomic sequencing.
Our fellow from Pakistan raises a very important point that I'd love to get you both to weigh in on, and that is, he mentions, Shiraz Hasnat says, Pakistan doesn't have a proper mechanism for medical testing, including gene tests, and even doctors are not trained in this regard. So I'm wondering, is there any sort of a network or consortium or effort on the part of researchers from low and middle income countries rather, to help countries like Pakistan catch up?
I think that's the case for many African countries as well, is that there are no genetic specialists, there's no genetic testing infrastructure set up, and setting up that kind of consortium is really important. I think that is one of the initiatives that the World Health Organization is talking about, is that although we've now established a network across Africa through Africa, and there are international networks for rare disease genetics specifically, setting something up that is specific for low and middle income countries seems to be a great need, because there's lots of knowledge to be shared and there's lots of opportunities to collaborate about setting up things, even in the most resource constrained setting. What kind of training programs are important to implement maybe in medical programs, so that there's some genetic understanding and genetic knowledge, even if it's not a medical genetic specialist that's working in a specific setting. So yes, I think that's a really important aspect and something that needs to be addressed.
And just to add to that, so there are a few initiatives. So the Global Genomic Medicine Collaborative, it's that's the focus, to try to implement genomic medicine worldwide, and with a special focus in low and middle income countries. And then, as Dr. Lombard mentioned, so the WHO is actually has made a big point on implementation of genomics. Currently, we're working on the global network for rare diseases, which is this effort between WHO and Rare Diseases International to start developing at a local, regional, and international level networks for diagnosis, education, referrals, clinical referrals for patients with rare diseases. So precisely so that countries that may not have the infrastructure or the professionals or the tests to do something can leverage some of the regional, and if not available in the region, the international environment around rare diseases.
Shiraz goes on to say, and this is a question I think so many journalists face when attempting to develop stories and find story ideas. He wants to know how we can be more specific while using normal language, not the medical technical terms, for readers or our viewers when you're reporting on rare disease. And this is a question I often put to speakers during programs is, what kinds of stories would you like to see? And how can journalists develop them?
I think one of the aspects that's really important to work on alongside scientists is to think about what some of these complicated medical genetic terms would be in local languages, and thinking about analogies that make sense in a community perspective to explain some of these more challenging issues. I think that's really important, and one of the aspects that Africa is also very focused on is to think about genomic literacy in different languages, not just in English and in French, but in local languages. What words are being used to describe certain aspects like inheritance and DNA? That's a really important aspect. And then to also think about visualizing some of these things. So thinking about things like a comic strip or a visual representation of a specific process. Sometimes a picture speaks for 1,000 words. So I think those are really important things to try and develop and to focus on to explain some of these more complicated matters.
Yeah, I totally agree, sort of making it more available in different languages, in different contexts. One other thing I would add is I think leveraging the experience and the knowledge of patient organizations is really important, because sometimes when we talk about rare diseases and that we can use the very technical language and the definitions, but really this is about people. So I think bringing that human aspect of how rare diseases impact people, impact families is really important, and having that partnership with patient organizations and patient representatives can be very helpful in how to communicate some of this information in ways that is understandable to a broad audience, and also respectful, because I think sometimes when we talk about diseases, we focus on the clinical symptoms and what is the phenotype, what's the clinical picture of these rare diseases. And sometimes that may be a bit dry, and sometimes maybe a bit insensitive from the perspective of the patient organizations. So I think having that sensitivity towards what is respectful of the patients and the families and the caretakers is also important when reporting about this.
Well, to that end, our fellow Jackie Opara from Nigeria says that in Africa, so many families run to traditional medicine or other avenues to treat rare disease or to diagnose them. And this opens a window for traditional medicine, which, there are so many different debates about that. Claudia, is traditional medicine in this realm something that you have seen and interacted with in terms of families opting to take that choice as opposed to going to hospitals and researchers?
It's not something that I have personally encountered yet, but definitely, I mean, especially now with social media and networks and that, there's a lot of information, right? And people recommend this and that for different things. So not even going with traditional medicine, but recently we actually had a family where we returned a result about a condition, and they asked us if they should put the patient in a special diet, in a non-gluten diet, or the keto diet, or things like that, right? Which sometimes it's very discussed around helping kids with autism and things like that. So one thing we mentioned to them is we have no evidence based on the genetic disorder to think that a change in diet would be meaningful for the patient. This is not a metabolic disorder. This is a structural disorder. So just to keep the kid with a healthy, balanced diet and that. So, I mean, in many cases, for many rare diseases, what families are looking for is to manage the symptoms, the sleep disorder, the seizures, the behavioral issues. So I wouldn't say not to traditional medicine, but I think it would have to be informed on what we know and specialist recommendations. So I would just encourage families to discuss that with their physicians and see if that works for them and if it's recommended or not, or counterproductive for the patients. That would be my comment.
Janae, I know, again, from living in East Africa, I heard of this phenomenon happening quite often, and people considering a child with developmental delays or other problems as maybe being cursed or bewitched, et cetera. So I'm wondering if there's an aspect of the H3 Africa initiative that centers exclusively on education, on combating this kind of belief.
Absolutely, Rachel. I think community engagement and education programs and building genomic literacy is a really important aspect of H3 Africa. And that's true. I think oftentimes what we see, especially with rare diseases where children are affected, is that there's a lot of superstition around what the causes of it might be, and also a lot of stigmatization, especially of the mother, and guilt feelings happening around the family. And what we do see is by engaging with patients and with family around the genetics and explaining what some of the genetic causes might be sharing findings with them from genetic testing, and really working with specifically with genetic counselors who could really engage with the family and explain some of this. It really does help to alleviate some of those feelings of guilt and stigmatization. And it's important for that to not only happen in the family context, but also in the community context, because very often the thoughts of the community and the community elders and how they respond to some of these aspects is really important. So yes, absolutely, that's really an important aspect of what Atria Africa is doing across the continent.
One of our other speakers who will be speaking with joining us on Wednesday mentioned that when journalists want to interview a patient, they tend to look for someone who has a visible rare disease, one that is easily identifiable, or et cetera. And that those are the ones that maybe they can get their editor to be interested in or think is worth coverage. So I wonder if there's something you can sort of communicate to journalists to help them understand the broader range of impact of rare disease.
Yeah, I also read the comment in the chat, and I thought that was really interesting because, yeah, I mean, to some extent, some of the visible ones are perhaps more shocking, they would catch attention more. But I think, and this is important to really talk about rare diseases more broadly, because on one side, it just perpetuates these perception that if it's a genetic condition, it's like these very severe congenital syndromes and disorders that are very severe and again visible, right? And that's the case for some, but not for many other rare diseases. And there are a lot of adults walking around that actually can have a rare disease, that have pain or have trouble managing their weight, for example, in some conditions, or depression or behavioral issues, neuropsychiatric problems and things like that are invisible, right? And that I think for journalists, I think maybe that's the homework, right? To start looking into these other conditions, to make them visible and to open that conversation about these conditions, because a lot of patients live in chronic pain, and that's not seen, right? And in many times that also again perpetuates these problems where they go to physicians and they say like, oh, I have pain and I have these other symptoms, but if they don't see them, they many times are dismissed by physicians or even by other people, saying like, oh, you look okay, there's nothing wrong. So again, I think just talking more about these other conditions, it's important to start creating and increasing that awareness that there are many other conditions that are not visible and people are struggling with.
Absolutely. And I think partnering with patient support groups and maybe increasing the visibility on social media already, I think it's an easy way to make that visibility and that awareness more globally available. I think that's maybe a really good place for the press to get involved and to spread the awareness in that way.
Can I just go back to your point? Hi, it's Sunny stepping in. I just want to go back to the point of about social media and the comment that was raised earlier of, oh, but you look good. You look okay, so everything must be okay. And we're actually dealing in the United States with different kinds of disability, issues around the New Jersey Senate race, where a candidate who is having accommodations is being stigmatized, and there's a big debate over that and the qualifications. Can you talk a little bit more about stigmatization and how you think that it could be addressed on a global level, because it really is a global issue?
I think very often stigmatization is born from a place of misinformation and not having access to information. So I really do believe that this is one way where through social media and through press, we could share information and normalize information that can really help people understand that there are different types of rare diseases, some visible, some not, what those aspects are, what some of the issues are that the families would be struggling with. And I think that kind of sharing of information is a really important aspect of destigmatizing aspects of rare diseases. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think precisely, right, having that access to social media, to information all the time, it's a double-edged sword. So we should try to use the good edge of it, and again, sort of trying to talk about this more openly, to normalize it in some way, right? That there are a lot of people, so about 1 in 10 people will be living with a rare disease. So I teach a course in genomics at the university, and it was interesting. Last year at the end of the course, many of my students said, like, I have never heard about a rare disease, and now that I think about it, my uncle or the dad of my friend, right? So these conditions are definitely more common than we tend to think about. And just starting to talk about it and raising awareness in education, it's important to start reducing this stigma, and also improving the access and the conditions of patients living with rare diseases, that there's more empathy and facilities for them to develop in all senses.
Sorry, I just want to correct something I said earlier. Of course, I didn't mean New Jersey. I meant the Pennsylvania Senate race with John Fetterman. So apologies for that. I just want to come back to the language question, because we get a lot of questions from journalists all the time about how to write about these things or how to speak about these things. Do you have any linguistic tips about what you would like people, and of course it's different in every culture, right, because of the languages and the way things are expressed, but do you have any guidelines for what kinds of languages journalists should use or not use, if there's terms that you think are helpful or unhelpful to this debate, or other guidance?
Well, I think, again, just in general, one would think maybe like pass it by a patient organization representative. I think they are very good allies in that sense, to sort of look at these language issues that may be problematic at some point. In terms of specific terms, I mean, some, like the genomics community has been moving apart from the use of mutation, just because it tends to have a negative interpretation. Not that it is in fact negative, but I think in many cases people misunderstand when we talk about mutation, and they interpret it as something bad. So we tend to now talk more about variants, right? Like it's variation, like everyone has variation. In some cases, this variation leads to disease. In some others, it leads to different hair color. So it's a way, again, to try to use language in a way to normalize some of these rare diseases, I would say.
I've stepped back, so I don't know if this question was asked, but it is an interesting question from Ernesto Cabral about forced migration. Did you discuss that issue?
No.
So Ernesto asks, as the access to genomic diagnosis in Latin America is difficult, could we say that forced migration is a consequence of rare disease? For example, in Peru, there are a lot of patients who are forced to move to the capital in order to have regular access to the few hospitals with geneticists. Is that happening in other countries in the region?
Well, I mean, in general, we do know that there's a lack of medical geneticists, of professionals that can counsel people. We don't have genetic counseling as a profession in Latin America, so that's another issue that we're trying to work with. So in terms of access, yes, this is a pattern that is recurrent. Services are centralized, so the major capital cities are the ones that have the big hospitals, the more professionals. Yes, I think it is possible, but also depending on the resources of the families, because many times, I mean, if they have the resources to relocate or travel, they would go to like the main capital or the main cities to seek medical care or testing or something. But also, there is the problem, right, of all those underserved communities that they just, I mean, they can't relocate. They are too far apart. They are like 2-3 hours from the nearest hospital and that. And how do we reach those communities? How do we make these technologies and these approaches accessible to them to have a diagnosis? And then let's tackle that problem, and then let's discuss okay, now how do we handle the disease and the treatment part as well? So yes, this is a problem. I don't know that necessarily will, again, because of the prevalence of the diseases, that this would be a forced migration and mass problem. But I can see that, yes, there will be families that will likely relocate to major cities to have access to services and testing and care and that.
In these final moments, let's get to a certain immutable bottom line about all of this, no matter whether you're in the US or in Uganda, and that's data, evidence. Where are we in each of your, when you think of each of your regions writ large, where are we in the goal of amassing enough data to move the needle on policy and advocacy?
That's a good question, Rachel. I was also looking at Hawkins' comment about the importance of registries and biorepositories to improve care. And I think initiatives like Atria Africa are making a difference on the African continent and moving that needle, but the movement is slow, and it definitely needs more support and more input to make sure that it's happening in each country across the continent. So I would say yes, there is movement. There's more awareness by the day. There are things like biorepositories and registries being set up, but there's still a long way to go. And there really is a need, I think, to shift the focus for genomics now to developing countries and to countries that are underrepresented in global research and initiatives like this to really start making a difference and moving that needle.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I've said many times, I think, I mean, the work that H3 Africa has done has been amazing in really launching and supporting genomics in Africa. And I've said it, like, if there was an H3 Latin America, would be a game changer for the region. Unfortunately, there isn't, but there are initiatives, there's movement. I agree. Things are moving in the right direction, but perhaps slower than we would like. Again, we recognize that we have this problem of representation and diversity and inclusion. But one thing that I would like to emphasize when we talk about this is that, yes, we need more data. We need to sequence more populations and biobanks in other parts of the world and that, but we have to do it in a way that it's equitable. We don't want to engage again in going to countries, to communities, to regions, and just like extracting samples, shipping them to the UK, to the US, to Europe, and just sequencing them, and then like the data, like maybe in some cases it gets released, in many other cases it isn't released, and even though these samples were sequenced, like we don't have access to this data, and there's no direct benefit to the populations. I think yes, it's important to recognize this need and this problem of diversity in the genomic data, but we have to change the approach. We have to ensure that countries, communities, patients will benefit from these sequencing approaches and these sequencing projects, and not just do extractive science just for the sake of increasing data and numbers and diversity in genomics.
Well, since you mentioned it, I'm going to wrap things up with a bit of a Molotov cocktail, if you will. And that is the issue of sort of a colonial perspective in terms of science and research. And since, Claudia, you just mentioned the term extractive research several times, I've seen several pieces recently about this issue of leadership when it comes to not only genomics, but a broad range of health-related issues. We know that when COVID first struck, and we would see pictures of the leading leaders of the strategy formation, they were all men and generally all primarily white males. So I wonder if I'd look for both of you to just sort of share your take on whether or not you agree with the fact that it is still an issue, and what's it going to take for us to see more women, for my personal point of view, at the forefront of these kinds of agendas.
Yes, Rachel, I think it is still an ongoing issue, and it is something that we're still dealing with. There isn't representation of people of color. There's not enough representation of women when these conversations happening around the table. But I think the way that needs to be addressed is by lobbying our local governments and our local support systems, because that's where the change needs to happen, is that it has to be a local solution. And we need to provide the evidence and lobby for that kind of support to happen locally, for this infrastructure to be built locally. Like Claudia was mentioning, that the benefit sharing happens in the local community, whether it's the scientific community or the patient community. And we can only do that through being, I guess, advocates for science and for the patients ourselves, and driving that on a global scale, but also in our local communities to do what we can, each individual ourselves. Yeah, I think that's one way to start to make the change.
Yeah, I agree that starting local, right? It's a good approach and a way to foster that diversity. I would also add that I also think that perhaps a two-way strategy, right, where we also ask and to some extent demand of organizations and higher structures, right, to be true to what they say, right? If they say diversity and inclusion and representation is important, then show it, right? Show it at the level of your leadership, at the level of the structure of the organization. So I think it's fair to say, like, if you as an organization are telling me that these are important values and important things that you prioritize, then what are you really doing to level that playfield? I think, and we had this conversation actually this morning, right? I think many organizations with a lot of members, a lot of people are interested in changing this, right? But how does that sort of build up to the leadership of the organization? And I think that's important to make sure, because if the organization, the leadership of the organization and the different bodies of a given organization are diverse and they have representation, they also will have different points of view and different takes on how to best implement something, what projects to pursue, what issues to think about. And that only comes from having these diverse representation in those upper layers of the different organizations.
I said that was the last one, but this really is the last question. And this is for Zane. And I saw it earlier and meant to ask it earlier. And this was from Diana, one of our fellows. I believe she's a photojournalist from South Africa. But she said that she didn't seem to see a lot of information in mass media about rare disease. It's not something that is talked about a lot or is top of mind. So if each of you would send us out of this session with your thoughts about what difference it would make if there was more contextual, accurate, insightful coverage of what rare disease is and the impact on families. Do you feel like it would make a difference if that were to occur?
Absolutely. I think that would make a significant difference. And I think that's the world of reporting, is that there's so many global issues to report on and so many things going on that maybe not even just in South Africa, globally, something like rare diseases kind of disappears from the scene because there's so many other things going on at the same time. And I think that's why opportunity in a platform like this is so important, to engage with the press and with journalists to build understanding and awareness and visibility of rare diseases. I think it's important for patients, but I also think it's important for just visibility and a common understanding across the board. So yes, I think this is something that's really important and that does need to take some priority in reporting.
Yeah, same. Completely agree. I think it would make a world of difference. Again, we live in a world that we have so many inputs all the time, all these media, all these news happening, and I think just sort of reinforcing the message, right? Like seeing these constantly in like, okay, there are these many patients living with rare diseases. These are the needs. These are the challenges. These are the different diseases. Some are visible, some are not. And sort of all the different aspects. It's such a expansive topic that just touching on all these different issues will really make a difference constantly. And we see a huge spike around Rare Disease Day in February, right, where everyone talks about rare diseases. But then like after February 28th, everyone sort of starts forgetting, and then it's like, what was this? So I think just, again, keeping the message going and drilling it, especially if we want to reach like policymakers, government, lawmakers, that I think it's very important. If we want to change policy in the different countries, in the different regions, like having this support, right? Like coming to a legislator and saying, this is important. The WHO says this is important. This is being covered in media. Like, you should pay attention to this. I think that's very useful for patient organization, advocacy groups, scientists, right, to request funding for this area. So yes, the role of journalists and the media, it's really important for making this message strong and changing things.
Claudia and Zane, you have given us an incredible amount of information to think about, a lot of context for our stories, no matter what corner of the world we'll be reporting on them. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for joining the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program, and to please be open to us reaching out to you to get more information or to help us clarify things even further. So thank you so much.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you for
Thank you for the invitation.